it has been very, very clear, and it was even clear in his first government, first administration, that Trump likes dictators in general. He admires them and respects them, and I think it is unambiguously clear that he wants to be one. And indeed, the way he's been governing the US over the last month or so is in line with that assumption. But furthermore, it's been very, very clear he particularly admires Vladimir Putin.
I think, Karan, it's better not to take this too seriously. It's really laughable, this kind of exchange. It's an exchange between schoolboys in a school playground. You did this, he did that, and so on.
He's on Russia's side, far more than he is on the European side. I think he's on Russia's side culturally, politically, intellectually, from every point of view. He despises, and his courtiers despise, European democracy and liberal freedoms, as he indeed despises these at home.
You must recognize that Mr. Trump's statements, though they may appear to be off the cuff and impulsive, I think often have an element of logic and truth in them. I think whether it's Greenland or Panama, etc., you can see that there is some logic behind these statements which may seem outrageous. In this case, which you have mentioned, I think that Mr. Trump recognizes that the real issue in Ukraine is between the USA and Russia.
From Trump's point of view, with Trump's view of the world, Ukraine is not an ally. It's an irritating dependent of no importance whatsoever, and which should be sacrificed, because who cares about it unless it gives him and America lots of money. And he doesn't regard, in my view, Putin as an enemy.
Mr. Zelensky was obviously thought he obviously felt compelled to reply to Mr. Trump. I think in many ways this was not a good idea on his part. I don't think it will do him any great service, or his country for that matter. We know that Mr. Trump is a very thin-skinned man, and he neither forgives nor forgets.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. An incredible, if not unbelievable, spat has broken out between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. Trump has called Zelensky a dictator who's doing a terrible job and claims he has only 4% support. For his part, Zelensky has said Trump is caught in a disinformation bubble, whilst both J.D. Vance and Michael Waltz have warned Zelensky against bad-mouthing the American president on social media. So what should we make of all of this? What does it tell us about Trump's attitude to the Russia-Ukraine war? And could this be the harbinger of a new style of politics? Today we present two separate viewpoints, one from Britain, another from India. My first guest is the internationally acclaimed columnist of the Financial Times, Martin Wolf. Mr. Wolf, the most incredible, if not unbelievable, spat has broken out between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. Trump has called him a dictator who's done a terrible job and claims Zelensky only has 4% support. Trump dismisses him as a modestly successful comedian, accuses him of starting the Russia-Ukraine war, and adds he better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. In response, Zelensky has accused Trump of living in a disinformation bubble and disputed his $500 billion bill for aid to Ukraine. Tell me, what do you make of these developments?
Well, first of all, I think they're shocking, but I'm not really at all surprised. It seems to me that Trump's orientations have been perfectly clear, and they're the people who supported him and the people who sort of justify the sorts of things he said, indeed who he is, have been fooling themselves or fooling others for a very long time. It has been very, very clear, and it was even clear in his first government, first administration, that Trump likes dictators in general. He admires them and respects them. And I think it is unambiguously clear that he wants to be one. And indeed, the way he's been governing the US over the last month or so is in line with that assumption. But furthermore, it's been very, very clear he particularly admires Vladimir Putin. I don't know whether there is some connection beyond the obvious one. There are lots of rumors about financial and other connections between Putin and Trump, but I have no comment on that. But he certainly admires him. And that was very famous in the last administration when on one occasion he basically saw Putin one-on-one. He agreed with Putin's assessments against those of his own intelligence officials. So we know this. He doesn't particularly dislike. On the contrary, he admires Putin's grab for Ukraine because as it's clear, he rather likes imperialism and imperialists. He's made rather clear he wants to take Greenland. He wants to take Panama. He mutters about Canada. I think, to my mind, he sort of thinks that Putin is the sort of strong leader a great country needs, like him in America. And he certainly doesn't care in the slightest about the independence of Ukraine, or for that matter, about liberal democracy. He's never, to my knowledge, spoken in favor of that principle on any occasion whatsoever. So none of this seems to me particularly surprising. He promised before he became president that he could sort out Ukraine in a day. Well, it's obviously taking it longer than that. But the only obstacle he has to delivering what Putin wants is Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, and therefore the legitimacy of Zelensky as the leader of the Ukrainian people. Needless to say, everything he says about Zelensky is a lie, but why on earth should that surprise it? He's a congenital liar. I mean, I can't easily think of anything he's ever said that is obviously true. So he needs to get Zelensky out of the way. He needs to delegitimize him. He wants to show that he's a great leader by making sure that whenever America supports any country, it gets more than suitable and appropriate recompense for it, money mainly. He is, as I said, clearly an imperialist. He likes that idea. Remember, by the way, even in the Iraq War, he thought that America should have taken some of the oil from Iraq as compensation. So none of this is in the least surprising. What he intends to do is reach a deal in which he sells Ukraine down the river and allows Putin to win. That's, I think, very clear. The other details of this deal, we don't know. Will there be any real effort by America to ensure that the peace, so-called peace, ceasefire holds? I don't know. You'll probably leave that to the Europeans. But I don't find any of this surprising, disgraceful, shocking in some sense, but not surprising.
But even if Trump's behavior and language is not surprising, what do you make of the fact that J.D. Vance and Michael Waltz have jumped into the fray? They've both publicly on social media or on television admonished Zelensky and told him that he mustn't badmouth the president. But the truth, it's the president who's doing the badmouthing.
Well, the answer to that is perfectly obvious. They're both members of the MAGA court. This is a court, obviously, with favored people at different levels. Their influence depends entirely, their survival, really. Vance will continue to be vice president, I assume, but it depends on the favor of Donald Trump. It's all very obvious. J.D. Vance would like to be the next presidential candidate for the Republicans, and to do that, he has to be an utterly loyal follower of Trump. You know what Trump did to Mike Pence when he got out of line. So Vance will have to stay loyal in this way. So will anybody working for or with Trump? absolute loyalty is expected and demanded. Whether they believe what they say, from my point of view, I neither know nor care. They are just stooges of the president.
Let me put something else to you. Trump and his administration also seem to have accepted the Russian position pretty close to hook, line, and sinker. They said it's unrealistic to expect Ukraine can join NATO or get back the territory it's lost to Russia. Trump has also said Putin wants peace, he trusts him, and he believes Putin has the upper hand, while suggesting at the same time that Zelensky is the one who's failed to make a deal. And now it's reported today that the United States has refused to back a UN resolution supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity. This increasingly sounds as if Trump has taken Russia's side, doesn't it?
Well, that's what I said. Of course, it's obvious. As I said, admires Putin. He admires Putin's effort to restore the integrity from Putin's point of view of Russia. He's on Russia's side far more than he is on the European side. I think he's on Russia's side culturally, politically, intellectually, from every point of view. He despises, and his courtiers despise European democracy and liberal freedoms, as he indeed despises these at home. And so none of that is in the least surprising. But he also thinks quite practically that the simplest way to end this war is to give Russia what it wants, because it's the bigger power. It's difficult and dangerous to try and defeat it. He doesn't want to put the resources of America or behind an effort to defeat Russia. Therefore, the logical thing to do is to accelerate the defeat of Ukraine. And so he's going to insist that Ukraine can't win. Of course, he will do so, and that no effort should be made to prevent it from losing, which he doesn't want to do. So, and then at the end, when Ukraine has been thoroughly sold down the river, he can claim he brought the peace that he promised. This is like the famous Munich agreement between Chamberlain and Hitler, in which Czechoslovakia was sold down the river, but worse, because Chamberlain at least thought it might bring peace and avoid World War III. And in this case, there is no such World War II. There's no such high objective. I don't think America envisages a war with Russia as at all plausible. He just wants to sell out Ukraine because he wants to give his friend Putin what Putin wants.
But in tilting so far towards Putin and Russia, Trump has also dramatically distanced himself from Europe. On Truth Social, he's posted, and I'm quoting him, "This war is far more important to Europe than it is to us. We have a big, beautiful ocean as separation." And earlier, Pete Hegseth, his defense secretary, said Europe would have to accept responsibility for its own defense. Doesn't this sound to you like some sort of 21st century Monroe Doctrine, America retreating behind its own borders?
I think it's bigger than that. The crucial thing to understand about the Trump administration, really, people should stop being surprised by any of this. They are completely repudiating the foundation of post-war American policy in Europe and the world. And that will be seen in multiple different directions with international institutions, international cooperation, climate change, international assistance on aid, all of that. They are repudiating the fundamental American constitutional structures, as we are already seeing and will see further. This is a revolutionary administration which intends to transform America and its position in the world. And the essence, it's not Monroe Doctrine, though that's part of it, is to make America an independent fortress power, controlling the Americas for sure, there's no doubt, but no doubt also seizing assets and wealth in other parts of the world, and doing so in a relatively opportunistic way from a constitutional structure that will be far more dictatorial than has been the American history. So this is a genuinely revolutionary administration in which Trump is surrounded by people devoted to this process of complete transformation of the US in the world. And everybody who looks at America has to understand that the America they have known, not just since the Second World War, but I would argue since its foundation, is effectively disappearing.
Let me put to you a question that flabbergasted audiences all over the world are probably asking themselves. Have you ever come across an American president publicly belittling a head of state who happens to be his ally whilst taking the side of an adversary? One would expect the exact opposite to happen, and yet this is precisely what Trump has done and seems to continue to want to do.
Yeah, but the point I'm making is that from Trump's point of view, with Trump's view of the world, Ukraine is not an ally. It's an irritating dependent of no importance whatsoever, and which should be sacrificed because who cares about it unless it gives him and America lots of money. And he doesn't regard, in my view, Putin as an enemy. I think he probably regards China as an enemy, but I think he feels that Putin is a power Russia is a power that in no way threatens America, is unable to threaten America. America has that beautiful ocean, as you said, between it and Europe, and it doesn't really matter what Russia does. And I suspect that Trump believes that probably, but he's not yet clear, we'll see, that Europe falls in the sphere of influence of Russia. And I don't think he cares about that at all. Now, that I think is a very serious misjudgment, but I think that's what he sees. And more important, and I do stress this, he thinks of Mr. Putin as his brother. He is like him, the sort of man he can admire and respect, and he identifies with him. I believe that's pretty clear. So, as I said, don't think this is the America or the American leadership that is familiar to us from the past. The past with Trump too is dead.
Let me raise one last issue with you. Is it only American presidents because of their power, or indeed this particular president because of his unique personality, that can get away with this sort of behavior and this sort of language? Or is there a danger that other heads of government, watching Trump get away with this language, might begin to speak and behave similarly? Could this become a new sort of politics?
Well, I think that we moved into the age of strongmen, and that's been obvious for quite some time. And the ideas of international law, constraint upon powerful countries' actions in dealing with the weak, that's sort of all gone. Now, that's a pretty chaotic sort of world. I think we're going to see more genuine imperialism. I think it's one of the huge mistakes that people in the global south made is to feel indifferent about what was happening in Ukraine, because it will, in all probability, threaten some of them. But no doubt other powerful nations and the rulers of other powerful nations may well decide that this allows them carte blanche to do what they want nearby. Particularly with countries that they find irritating, that they find disruptive or hostile. So I would think this is, as I said, carte blanche for Vladimir Putin, but also for Xi Jinping. We know what that might mean. I don't know what lessons Mr. Modi will learn from this, but it will be interesting to see. But generally, I expect powerful countries to act in ways we have not been, by and large, have not been familiar with in the recent past. I mean, since the Second World War, that's recent. But of course, there were these interventions before in Iraq and so forth. I just suspect we will see more of it. And reminds me of the famous comment in Thucydides's book on the Peloponnesian War, that the strong do what they can, and the weak must suffer what they cannot avoid.
Absolutely. And so powerful leaders of powerful countries bullying smaller countries and their less powerful leaders is going to become the new normal.
Well, I think the That's what Mr. Trump believes. And with America out of the way, take America's very different view much of the time in the post-war period out of the way, no longer opposing this. If as the Trump administration remains in power or its successors are similar, we are moving into a completely different and, in my view, unambiguously far worse world.
Martin Wolf, thank you very much for the time you've given me, and thank you very much for your analysis of this bizarre situation that's developed in the last 48 hours. Take care, stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Welcome back. I'm now joined by India's former Foreign Secretary and former Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth, Krishnan Srinivasan. Mr. Srinivasan, the most incredible, if unbelievable, spat has broken out between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. Trump has called Zelensky a dictator who's done a terrible job and claims Zelensky only has 4% support. Trump dismisses him as a modestly successful comedian, accuses him of starting the Russia-Ukraine war, and adds he better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. In response, Zelensky has accused Trump of living in a disinformation bubble and disputed his $500 billion claim against Ukraine. What do you make of this development?
Well, I think, Karan, it's better not to take this too seriously. It's really laughable, this kind of exchange. It's an exchange between schoolboys in a school playground. You did this, he did that, and so on. I think we didn't go into the fact or fiction of these exchanges. I think there are two other issues which are reasonably important, which are worth examining. I think the first is the general vulgarism that's set into public discourse, public communication. I would say that this is largely due to the media and even more perhaps to the social media. We know that Mr. Trump engages with the media very often and is daily on social media and is on his own platform, Truth Social. And I think this has caused a general deterioration of public intercourse throughout the world, not least in our own country among the political circles. So I think that this is something that we need to get used to. The second point, which is worth making, I think, is that Mr. Zelensky was obviously thought he obviously felt compelled to reply to Mr. Trump. I think in many ways this was not a good idea on his part. I don't think it will do him any great service, or his country for that matter. We know that Mr. Trump is a very thin-skinned man, and he neither forgives nor forgets. And we must remember that he and Zelensky go back a long way. They have history. I think it was in 2019 that Mr. Trump asked Zelensky for some help in investigating Mr. Biden, then his opponent, Mr. Biden's son's business activities, and Zelensky sidestepped this and refused to cooperate with Trump, and I don't think Trump has ever forgotten that. So the second point I wanted to make was I don't think this exchange necessarily will help Zelensky a lot.
You know, Trump and his administration also seem to have accepted the Russian position pretty close to hook, line, and sinker. They've said it's unrealistic to expect Ukraine to join NATO or get back the territory it's lost to Russia. Trump has also said Putin wants peace, he trusts him, and he believes he has the upper hand, while suggesting that Zelensky is not important enough to be involved in talks. And now, most recently, it's reported that the United States has refused to back a UN resolution supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity, and the Financial Times in Britain reports that the United States has objected to a G7 statement referring to Russian aggression in Ukraine. Doesn't this increasingly sound as if Trump and his administration have clearly taken Russia's side?
Well, I think that it's difficult to analyze that in terms of a Ukraine solution. I'd just like to say that when we listen to Mr. Trump's various statements, I think we shouldn't give them too much credibility in terms of strategy or in terms of tactics. Mr. Trump is an emotional politician. He goes by instinct, and I think many of his utterances, his opinions are due to an instinctive reaction rather than a well thought out strategic or tactical consideration. I think here, in many ways, though, you must recognize that Mr. Trump's statements, though they may appear to be off the cuff and impulsive, I think often have an element of logic and truth in them. I think whether it's Greenland or Panama, etc., you can see that there is some logic behind these statements which may seem outrageous. In this case, which you have mentioned, I think that Mr. Trump recognizes that the real issue in Ukraine is between the USA and Russia. That it was in the 1990s, if you remember, that the NATO alliance, after the unipolar moment, when East Germany reunited with the Federal Republic, that in that unipolar moment, the Americans undertook not to move the frontiers of NATO eastwards towards the Russian, the Russian borders. Now that undertaking was breached. The United States did move the NATO borders much closer to the Russian borders. The Russians repeatedly stated that this would be a casus belli if the Ukraine country also was incorporated into NATO. This was generally ignored by the United States. And I think that what it resulted in was the eventual war and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So to that extent, I think that Trump is right, that this is an issue between the United States and Russia, and that the Ukrainians have become a bit player. The second point that you referred to was the question of Zelensky not doing a deal to settle this problem. I think there's some truth in that too, because you may remember that in Turkey, and 1 month after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Ukrainians and the Russians had several meetings, and those meetings produced a document which would have ended the war there and then. The document is in public record, so I don't want to go into the details, but it provided generally for Ukraine not joining NATO, for Ukraine reducing its armed forces, for the Russian withdrawal and the status of Crimea and the Russian occupied territories to be discussed over a certain period. So I don't want to go into that detail, but I'd just like to say that perhaps there is always some degree of logic in what President Trump states.
But so if I understand your answer correctly, unlike many others who are ridiculing what Trump has said and done, who are dismissing it as ludicrous and silly and unacceptable, you actually see a fair degree of logic behind Trump's position, and a logic that is borne out by the events of the past.
I think much of it is borne out even by more recent events, because the fact that the Americans and the Russians are discussing but not only their bilateral relations, but also the Ukraine situation seems to suggest that Mr. Trump strongly believes, and the Russians also, that this is a matter between the Russians, between Washington and Moscow. And they would expect, I imagine, that both Ukraine and Ukraine supporters to fall in line.
Now, the third thing that Trump has done is to dramatically distance himself from Europe. On Truth Social, he's posted, and I'm quoting him, "This war is more important to Europe than it is to us. We have a big, beautiful ocean as separation." Earlier, his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, had said Europe would have to accept responsibility for its own defense. Does this sound to you as if Trump is adopting some sort of 21st century Monroe Doctrine, in a case of America retreating behind the safety and security of its own borders?
Well, Karan, I think that that American opinion over several decades has felt that Europe is getting a kind of free ride on the back of American economy and security. And I think in this respect, Trump only echoes what that American sentiment has been and probably continues to be. It's interesting that Trump's popularity rating at the moment, you may believe this or you may not give it credibility, or you may, is now 45%, which is more than Mr. Biden ever enjoyed during the entire tenure of his presidency. But more significantly, Mr. Trump's popularity rating among Republicans, including the rating for his foreign policy, is a staggering 90% plus. So I think that Trump believes very strongly that his core constituency supports what he is doing, including in Europe. I think that the Europeans, of course, are now in some degree of a flap because they're considering how to deal with this new type of transatlantic situation where they have to fend for themselves. They haven't helped their own cause over the years by not contributing what was required to the NATO budget. It was 2% of GDP at one time. Many of them now are up to 2% of GDP, but now Mr. Trump wants to raise it to 5% of GDP, which most of the countries, frankly, cannot afford. So this puts them in a great dilemma. But I think that where we have to appreciate what Trump is doing, it is based on very solid political support from his own core constituency. As far as we are concerned, who are not Europeans and not Americans, I think we can perhaps have a wry smile about this situation because, over the last 70 years, ever since the Second World War, the Europeans haven't really given as much importance to the rest of the world, Africa and Asia, as they should have done. Let me just give you one example. There's been a trade agreement between India and the European Union, which has been negotiated for 18 years without any conclusion so far. I mean, I think that this shows the kind of neglect that the Europeans have had towards the rest of the world, secure in the belief that the transatlantic alliance would be there for all time. I think that if the Europeans now start to realize that there is the rest of the world that they have to deal with and could deal with greatly to their profit, I think it would be to the advantage of everybody.
I hear everything you said, Mr. Srinivasan, but let me come back with a somewhat different question. And I'm going back deliberately to the spat between Zelensky and Trump. Have you ever come across an instance of an American president publicly belittling a fellow head of state who is also an ally, whilst actually taking the side, consciously, deliberately, and repeatedly, of the adversary? Isn't this the exact opposite of what you'd expect? And yet it's happening.
It is the opposite of what one would expect. You're perfectly right. But we live in a very new world now. Mr. Trump has been in office, I think, just for about a month now, and he has really set the cat among the pigeons in many respects. So I think that while it's a kind of new international politics that we're confronting, when I say we, I think the rest of the world outside the USA, outside the Oval Office perhaps, but I think, it's old politics too, Karan. When you look back on it, Mr. Trump's views are not that dissimilar to Viscount Palmerston's in the 19th century. You remember that Palmerston said that we have no eternal allies, we have no eternal enemies, we have eternal interests. I think this is very much the policy that Mr. Trump is pursuing. And I think frankly, I think all of us observers, all the other countries in the world, will have to take due note of the fact that this is a very new, very rational, very egocentric, if you like, type of policy that Mr. Trump is pursuing. And in a way that every country has to adjust to this situation. What will probably happen is that every country will also prioritize their own interests first.
In which case, let me ask you, is it only an American president because of his power, or this particular president because of his unique personality, who can get away with this sort of behavior? Or is there a danger that other heads of government might soon begin to speak and behave the way President Trump is doing?
Yes, I think the implication of your question is perfectly correct. I think what Mr. Trump's views and attitudes, his actions, are certainly based on power projection. And this is power projection which is almost nakedly expressed. I think that therefore other countries may well like to follow suit. But you know that when you consider the definition of a great power is a country which can influence events outside its borders. I think very few countries actually have that resource. Mr. Trump clearly is banking on the fact that America has the most powerful military. It has at the moment the most powerful economy. And it has a currency, the dollar, which is used as the foundation for all international financial transactions. He is very anxious to protect and preserve these three factors, to give America the ability to project power. And I think he's doing it in a very obvious fashion. Now, when you ask whether this is going to be a kind of template followed by other countries, I'd say that very few countries have the attributes to do this. Those who have the attributes may certainly be tempted to do this, but there is also a cultural problem. The Americans have been known for a certain brash attitude to life, and certainly in political matters too, international and domestic political matters. Other countries might have a different culture, and they may not be as upfront. They may be more reticent, more polite instinctively. So I think it's not necessarily so that this is going to be a contagion that travels across many countries. Firstly, because very few countries have that ability to project power. And secondly, there is a cultural difference between the United States and other countries.
So there is the potential for other countries behaving the way President Trump has, but you don't think it's automatic that they will. And certainly cultural differences will preclude some from doing so.
That's right, exactly, as much as they perhaps would want to.
Mr. Srinivasan, thank you very much for the time you've given me. Take care. Stay safe.
You.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.